For centuries, the Middle Kingdom looked outward with curiosity and inward with pride. This is China, a civilization unto itself. And so it stayed, turning away from Europe's troubles in the 18th century. Its people lived comfortably, safely within the protection of the Great Wall. As the outside world grew darker, China remained a radiant jewel. But jewels have their flaws, and this one would shatter. This is the story of how the West intruded into China, stole its sovereignty and crushed its confidence, all while selling it opium, robbing its people and calling it progress. At its peak, Ming China was a magnificent beast. Its emperor lived in a gigantic palace complex called the Forbidden City. It had a sprawling bureaucracy that kept everything running smoothly. For centuries, China had been feeding itself, fending off invaders and accumulating wealth. Europeans would soon call it the Middle Kingdom because it was the center of the world. And the emperor believed it. He saw his duty as bringing order to the barbarians around him. Most foreigners were allowed into China only if they brought tribute and kowtowed before the emperor. That's exactly what the word tribute means in this context. To the Chinese, the other countries were little more than tributaries, and their rulers were little more than obedient sons. But there was a problem. While Ming China ruled over everyone else, it didn't know what lay beyond the ocean. There were European sailors who had circumnavigated Africa and were making their way to India. Others had crossed the Pacific and reached the Americas, but Chinese maps still showed the world ending at the Eastern Ocean. As late as the 17th century, Chinese sailors were only making it to Japan, India, and Southeast Asia. But despite its lack of explorers, China was brimming with inventors. It had invented gunpowder, paper money, movable type, and the compass. By the time Europeans arrived, China had invented pretty much all of the things that made modern life possible. And so it was that in the early 17th century, Chinese scholars listened with polite interest to the stories of European sailors, but dismissed their tales of distant lands as mere fiction. They already knew how great China was. What more did these foreigners have to teach them? In 1627, the Portuguese had sent a group of Jesuit missionaries to learn about China and report back to Europe. When Matteo Ricci and his colleagues arrived in Beijing, they were shocked by the riches and sophistication of the place. The best way to get close to the emperor, they heard, was to master Confucianism. And so they spent years memorizing ancient texts and impressing the Chinese mandarins with their knowledge of astronomy, calendars, and clocks. Soon enough, they were invited to show the emperor the secrets of Western science. Ricci presented an orrery to demonstrate the phases of the moon. The emperor watched with interest. Ricci explained how the seasons changed as the earth moved around the sun. The emperor nodded knowingly. He already knew this. Later, he would famously tell Ricci, "You come from afar with your astronomical theories, and you tell me the earth moves. I have known this for 400 years. What Ricci hadn't expected was that the Chinese would accept Christianity alongside Confucianism. In fact, the court began to see Christianity as a new Confucian teaching, and the emperor even gave Ricci permission to convert the populace. For 2 decades, Jesuit missionaries flourished in China, building schools, churches, and hospitals. But by the mid-17th century, the Chinese began to wonder why the Pope hadn't written back to the emperor. Not only that, they discovered that the cross that Ricci wore wasn't merely a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of Western domination. Once the Chinese realized that the Christian God was the same God that European kings worshipped, they began to suspect that the missionaries were spies. The court felt betrayed and ordered the Jesuits to leave. But that was okay because they had done what they had come for. Europeans were welcome in China, not as preachers, but as merchants. By the mid-1700s, European demand for Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea was skyrocketing. They had tried growing tea in Europe, but it just didn't taste right. Their own porcelain was coarse and delicate. They needed China's strong, elegant wares. They also wanted to buy Chinese inventions. The machine that makes beautiful, intricate clocks, for instance, seemed like pure magic to the Europeans. They wanted that technology too. There was only one problem. China wasn't interested in European clocks, guns, or paintings. The only thing that caught their eye was silver. At first, the Chinese were happy to accept that. In fact, They loved watching Europeans squabble over tea. After all, they thought these white-skinned barbarians can't even keep themselves entertained. We might as well sell them our tea. But by the 1760s, the British and Chinese were beginning to resent each other. China was draining Europe of silver. At the same time, Europeans were flooding China with cheap silver coins. The Chinese realized that they were buying more than just clocks and paintings. They were purchasing their own demise. So they shut the door in the faces of the Europeans. In 1757, the Chinese government created a system that funneled European traders into one port, Canton, now Guangzhou, where they could trade only with one approved merchant. The intent was clear. The Chinese didn't want to do business with Europe anymore, but the British weren't ready to give up. They had a king who believed that Britain was destined to rule the world, and that included China. The British East India Company was eager to expand, and its leaders pressured the government to open more ports. But the Chinese refused. They told the British that their markets were saturated with European goods and that they weren't interested in trading anymore. Besides, they said, foreigners shouldn't be walking around the interior of China. And besides, the British didn't bring any cash, they only brought worthless silver. But the British couldn't stand the sight of Chinese prosperity. They craved China's riches and its size. For years they had been trying to invade India, but the Chinese were stopping them by arming the Indians against the British. If China fell, India would fall too. And with China out of the picture, Europe could become rich beyond its wildest dreams. It was an irresistible proposition, and the British quickly found a way to make it happen. They decided to sell China opium. At first, the Chinese were furious, but once they started smoking opium, they couldn't stop. The Chinese were so hooked that in 1839, when the emperor's representative Lin Zexu launched a crackdown on opium dens, the addicts rose up against him. They burned his warehouses and attacked his men. Soon, the entire city of Guangzhou was in chaos. The British and Chinese were fighting over opium. When the British consul tried to intervene, the Chinese seized his property and put him on trial. The emperor then ordered all foreigners to leave China. But the British didn't budge. They sent 200 warships to bombard the Chinese coast. Lin Zexu fled inland. Then the British took Guangzhou and demanded that the emperor pay for all the opium they had lost. China refused. The Opium War had begun. Within months, Chinese soldiers were surrendering to the British. They had fought bravely, but against the British warships and rocket launchers, they stood no chance. At the peace conference, the Chinese had to sign away more than they ever imagined. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the emperor ceded Hong Kong to the British. That wasn't all. He also agreed to open 5 more ports to foreign trade. Even worse, the Chinese would pay for the costs of the war. All of that was bad enough. But the most humiliating part was yet to come. The Chinese had to include a special clause in the treaty. Any European who broke Chinese law would be tried in a foreign court, not a Chinese one. Over the next few decades, China signed more treaties that eroded its sovereignty. Missionaries flooded in and converted millions of Chinese. The Qing court was becoming weaker by the day. Rebellions erupted across the country, such as the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion. But none of this woke up the Chinese. The best they could do was fight back with fists and farm tools. They didn't know that the biggest threat to their future was the very fact that they had surrendered their sovereignty. In retrospect, it seems obvious that signing those treaties was a huge mistake. But at the time, most Chinese scholars thought it was a clever move. It was just a bit of realpolitik. Why risk going to war when you can get more concessions through diplomacy? But this way of thinking had a downside. While it made sense to sign treaties with the British and Americans, it didn't work with the Japanese. The Japanese were desperate to carve out a bigger piece of the Chinese market. When the Qing government refused, the Japanese decided to invade. By 1900, they controlled Korea and were marching toward Beijing. This was the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese called it the War of National Humiliation. The Japanese beat them soundly and occupied the capital. They forced the Qing emperor to flee. The dynasty was finished. China was about to change forever. Before that, though, something interesting happened. For centuries, China had looked inward with pride. It had seen the outside world as a barbarian kingdom filled with ignorant and brutish people. But when the Europeans showed up, It had to acknowledge that they knew something that the Chinese didn't. They had weapons, ideas, ships, and maps. But now, after all of those defeats, the Chinese were looking outward with curiosity, wondering what the West had to offer. It was as if they were finally waking up. The question was, would they choose to fight back or embrace the intruder? We'll find out in Part 2. A world unto itself. China looked outward with curiosity and inward with pride. Ming China was a magnificent beast, but jewels have their flaws, and this one would shatter. What do you think China's reaction would have been if the West had approached with respect instead of with weapons? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.